hope you had the chance to look around Susie's show. Obviously, very much in connection with the project at the Serpentine Gallery, which she's going to talk about. So Susie's been showing with us for, I think, over 15 years. Yeah,
since 2004.
Yes, exactly. And always quite sort of elaborate projects, as you probably know if you know her work. But don't want to say too much now. I'll pass over to Susie in just a second. But I hope you enjoy. And if you have any other questions after the talk, feel free to ask either Susie herself, or if you want to talk to any of us. This is Jessica, my colleague. Please do.
Thanks, Nina. So, we'll come in here. So, I'm not quite sure where to start. So, basically, the first, this is the room for Survivor F, and through the portal is the room for the Escapist, which you probably know, and then, so this Survivor F was the first project, which I started in 2016, around the middle of 2016, I finished a previous project, HFT the Gardener, and I was kind of, what usually happens when I finish a large project is I decide that I'm not going to make any more art and I'm going to write a novel. And this seems to happen roughly every 3 years. And then, so on that third year I start writing a novel, which then fails. But in this case, I started a novel which turned into Survivor F, because I was doing a lot of diagrams to plan out the plot of the novel, and suddenly one of them became, I think, one of these, the first one maybe, so it eventually turned into something like this. That wasn't actually anything to do with the plot of the novel, but it morphed into this, which then, in a way, the actual subject matter is totally different, but somehow the one thing led to the other with a kind of blurry bit in the middle. There was a character in the novel who invented an alter ego who was an algorithm, and she gave like a voice to this algorithm, and so the one bit that's carried over here is actually the voice of the algorithm in that box. It's an algorithm that speaks and tells you about its life. So, but in terms of this Survivor F project, I was trying to imagine a completely hypothetical time and space, probably in the future, where possibly humanity no longer existed, where possibly there was possibly one human survivor who somehow transmitted all of this back to us. But then possibly it wasn't human, possibly it was a machine intelligence. And so there's, I wrote a lot for this, not in terms of this novel, but I was writing a lot of phrases and things, and a lot of those phrases which were trying to describe that other reality went into these watercolours. And these were the first things that I made. I started off making these. And what happened while I was making these is that I realised that even though I completely rejected the idea of oil painting since the 90s, the only way to really fully expand this project visually was through painting again. And so that was quite a big decision, because I had really rejected oil painting for a hell of a lot of reasons, which you may or may not know about. They're probably the same reasons that most people don't make oil paintings who maybe once did, or who ideologically, you find them ideologically problematic. But I thought, well, who cares? I really want to visualize these things in that way, and that's what I had to do. So then I thought, well, am I going to do large ones? Like in the 80s, I used to do hundreds of large oil paintings, and I've never been more glad than to leave them behind, to be honest. But here's this blinking storage problem again, you know. And so I think, so then, what happened? Normally, I do a large project like this, and it lasts 3 years, and then I come to the end, go through this process, start a new one. But in the case of Survivor F, about halfway through, the Serpentine approached me and asked me, would I do a commission? And we had various meetings, and it was like, I thought it was just going to be like a small thing. I would just do a very small project which would be online, and it would be something like lots of other small things I do which would just happen alongside a big project. But they got more and more excited about developing it into a big project, and I realised that that's what they actually wanted at one of my big projects, which seemed like, that didn't really seem appropriate for a digital commission. But then the more I got to know this team there, the more we all went into some other zone, and it was like seemed a foregone conclusion that that's what I was going to do. And we started talking about black holes and theories around black holes, because I'd just been at CERN, and so I was about a year and a half ago I got this CERN award, which meant I could go on a residency there for various periods of time, and I'd had this idea, which was based on this a theory I'd had about 5 years ago after I'd seen a TV documentary about the holographic universe thing, which had explained it I'd kind of understood it as something which had come out of black hole theory, where around a black hole is the event horizon, and so apparently any three-dimensional, larger dimensional object that enters a black hole leaves a two-dimensional equivalent of itself on the event horizon. So that sets up a holographic relationship interdimensionally, and so that everything exists, everything possibly in the universe also exists in a two-dimensional space. When I was asked to do this CERN thing, I had this idea to make a film, which would be testing out I haven't actually explained the theory. The theory was that all of art history was only ever an attempt to describe that holographic reality. And at CERN, I had that idea through a video, to fast forward the whole of art history in a loop, in the same way that the Large Hadron Collider at CERN accelerates particles to test its theories. I wanted to accelerate the whole of art history to test my theory, and when you come to the end of the video, it goes around in a loop. So at CERN, I was able to interview all these leading theoretical physicists about this black hole theory, about this holographic universe theory. And I recorded them, and they tried to explain how this two-dimensional data exists on a boundary, which is in some infinite part of space, which you can never quite reach to test it out. It's incredibly theoretical and unprovable to a large extent. But one of them said, if, for example, our universe was actually inside a black hole itself, then the event horizon of the black hole that our universe had come through would possibly be reachable, and we possibly would be able to find a two-dimensional version of ourselves and everything we know on this border boundary. Then I asked them about my theory. I gradually led them up to my theory about art history, and they more or less agreed with me that this theory was probably quite reasonable. So I'm glad I recorded that as well, and I used that as a soundtrack of my video, where I accelerated like about 24,000 images from art history chronologically through this super fast loop. So when I was meeting up with the Serpentine people again, I was telling them all about this, and they were getting very, very excited about all of those things, and they were also thinking about maybe going to CERN and setting up some projects of their own, some collaborations of their own, and so it was during that time, which was 1.5 years into this, that I had this idea to do these portals as a digital commission, to do these portals as maybe we should go in here now as download the thing. going into the other room. Someone went into the office. Oh. It's all right, he's come back. No, it's all right. So, yeah, I had the idea. I did these actually originally on Photoshop, and I had them with a sky background. And my original idea for Serpentine was that I would have these portals online, and that anyone could download them. Would make them to fit all sizes of computers and iPhones and phones and everything, and the people would be able to download them and use them as their background image, so that they would be like an interface between, you know, your everyday reality sitting behind your screen and where you go when you go into computer space, whether it's just you know, like into the code of whatever you're doing on your computer, or whether it's into the internet, or, you know, actually soon the interplanetary internet, for example. So these things with a black hole in the middle, with the event horizon, and like a kind of poetic text around the side, would be like interface of the space between those two realities for people who downloaded them, having them on their desktop image. So that was the starting point, and then there was this idea that developed this into a larger project, and so about 10 minutes later, I started the Escapist comic strip. I was sitting under a tree somewhere, and episode 1 just arrived in my notebook. And then every day for a few months, or however long, every other day, I just went to these different trees on Hampstead Heath, and another episode would come to me. And so this kind of turned into a slightly channeling project, because I'd had this idea for someone called the Escapist for a while, but he hadn't materialized, and somehow he materialized through these portals. I'm not really sure how that happened. And then, obviously, I needed to start making paintings to elaborate on this whole new space. So I guess in terms of who this Escapist is, it's like a non-specific interplanetary entity who may live inside a black hole, may not. Sometimes he seems like he lives inside a black hole. Sometimes he's in a display in a vitrine inside the Museum of Black Hole Spacetime, from which he seems to have escaped. So I kind of like abandoned Survivor F for a bit, and then I kept going back to it and doing more paintings for it, coming back to the Escapist. And then this really weird thing happened, which is that I did this painting of the Museum of Black Hole Spacetime, and I realized, like, I'm not quite sure what part of my brain realized, but it was clear to me that that was a portal between the two projects, that inside that museum there was like a portal that led back to Survivor F, and that these projects, because I'd been doing them simultaneously, which was unusual for me, obviously had overlapped, and I couldn't have two separate bits of my brain that were working independently, that they kind of connected. And so hence this portal, which divides the two bodies of work. And what you've got over here as part of this Escapist video, because all this investigations at CERN, which had been really very exciting, because I'd found that these theoretical physicists were like these complete free thinkers who just had these brains to think outside every single box you'd ever imagine, and that's how I like to be. And so I just loved it there. I thought it might be like a nightmare, but actually it was amazing. And so one of them, my favourite one, this guy Wolfgang, who was the most outside the box. For example, when we were chatting, and he said to me, hold on, he took my pencil and he said, let me just draw you. So for example, this is particle physics, and he did these arrows, and then he did another circle to the side, and then he said, and this is the brain, and then he did another circle in the triangle, and he said, and this is consciousness. And I said, but you're a particle physicist, you're not supposed to believe in consciousness. Everything's supposed to boil down to particle physics. That's what your PhD student told me. He said that's rubbish. Anyway, and then he started talking about extraterrestrials. And of course, so that was very exciting. And I thought, well, I said, so they exist? Yeah, of course they exist, he said, because it's about probability. There's billions and billions of planets out there. And it would be ridiculous if they didn't exist. So I said, well, how do you fancy drawing being one of them? Because we got all the paints out. They were doing all these really nice watercolours of the holographic universe principle for me, for my other thing, my video. And so this guy was going, he just did this, just like this one, an orange one with the black triangle. And so as a result of that, I asked a few other people. Well, on my first, this was my second trip there. There's another guy there who was doing the interview with me in the Serpentine, Michael Doser, who's head of antimatter, and he's an experimentalist, not a physicist, and he's a bit hostile to some of the theoretical ideas because they're just so abstract. But he said, yeah, I'll do one of these extraterrestrial things. So he's done a chronological timeline of extraterrestrial life forms from before the Big Bang until the, I think it's, 7 billion years or whatever in the future. And so I finished my previous project, the video, and so I asked, can I come back again? And I went back in March, and I lined up as many of the scientists as possible to get them to do these extraterrestrial things, which they were more than happy to do. They all were totally, into it. So I thought, well, I'm going to include that in this project because the Escapist is probably an extraterrestrial, and then this is like kind of, it's almost like where art and science meet at this point of the imagination. So I thought it would be really useful to bring in this actual quite concrete example of what these people in CERN are thinking, which they wouldn't normally expose, I suppose.
They're probably not asked on a daily basis.
Not
to
generally,
draw an
no.
extraterrestrial.
Probably not. Most of them probably wouldn't bring it up, But they do bring up a lot of amazing things, like the ones that start talking about dark matter, for example. They've had like maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years doing the same experiment in some cases where they had all that time for their enormous brains to think up all kinds of things. And they they have. And sometimes they tell you what they are. So, yeah, I think, I'm not sure what else I can say off the top of my head.